In this criminally short video, I'm going to take a stroll through the timeline of major game consoles from 1977 to 2006. In particular, I'm going to focus on the massive uncertainty that occurred during the 32-bit era of the fifth generation of gaming, the Wild West of gaming. I'll observe the major overlaps on the timeline that resulted in key battles and how games media tended to cover them. What did it all look like graphically? And at the end of this video, I'm also going to take a look at what could have been with a system that unfortunately never was. So let's dive in. I'm going to be very brief from 1977 until 1993, probably disrespectfully brief, because while I find all video game history to be very interesting, it's the mid to late 90s that I find to be the most compelling. So, of course, 1977 ushered in the Atari 2600, my first gaming console on a black and white television, and a console that would continue to live on in one fashion or another until the early 90s. 1985 saw the introduction of the original Nintendo, and we can't really call this a skirmish between the Nintendo and the 2600, as the industry was just sort of on its knees by the time the Nintendo came around. Just because you could still buy the 2600 doesn't mean it was flourishing by any means. The Nintendo would go on to have a very healthy lifespan, stretching toward 1995. Then we have the Sega Master System, a system I've never played, nor do I have any real knowledge of it. A few years later, 1989, we see the introduction of the Sega Genesis, followed very quickly by the Super Nintendo. Now both systems exist simultaneously on the timeline for a good number of years, and we therefore have our first real skirmish. If you haven't read the book Console Wars, I would strongly recommend that you find a way to get your hands on it. I think it's pretty cheap. You'll learn things about Nintendo that I believe are still true to this day, as well as how a guy, Tom Kalinske, with zero gaming knowledge, somehow managed to wrestle away Nintendo's dominance, if only for a short time. Fascinating stuff. Now we've arrived in 1993, and we see the start of a big clustermuck of systems with several companies all trying to get a piece of that rich pie. This was my favorite gaming period ever. Very hard lessons were learned during this time, for both companies and consumers, a young version of myself being one of them. This was a time when it was truly confusing as to which system or company you should get behind and invest in. Things weren't certain, far from it, and it was easy to buy something that could be discontinued without much warning, a notion that Next Generation magazine captured well on their December '95 cover. I've always liked Next Generation magazine. I remember going into the local supermarket and reading it on the floor of the store with one of my best friends. And so we're going to use that, Next Generation, as our quasi-guide to gaming media opinions throughout this timeline. So in 1993, we have the launch of the 32-bit 3DO, a truly revolutionary system at the time, and one that cost $700 when it first hit stores. Now, eventually that price did drop. Actually, it wasn't even eventually. It happened pretty quickly once they realized nobody was buying it at that price. I think it went down to $400 or $500 within a 6-month period. And soon after that it dropped again, down to about $299 I believe, and that's when I picked one up. And I don't regret buying the 3DO. Some of the coolest games I've ever played have been on that system. Blade Force, Killing Time, Star Control 2, some really great ones. But I do regret that I talked one of my best friends into buying one of them shortly after I did. Something that he has never let me live down. He wanted the PlayStation 1, and I told him how cool the 3DO was. How we could daisy chain our controllers together and all of that. Well, he bought in. The 3DO would also usher in a period of magazines profiting from uncertainty. It wasn't uncommon to see magazine covers that looked like this. Covers that made you extremely nervous if you had just invested $400, $500, $600, $700 in one of these machines. And of course, the lifespan of the 3DO did end up being quite short. Next up, we have the 64-bit Jaguar. At least it's 64-bit if you do the Atari math, you know. 32 plus 32, but that's a whole other issue. And like the 3DO, the Jag very quickly had covers questioning its staying power. Is this the last of Atari's 9 lives, Next Generation asks? Probably something I would have written if I worked there at the time. Either way, the lifespan was about equivalent to the 3DO, and just a footnote in history now. But that hasn't stopped many people from retrospectively creating a console battle between these two special systems. Just do a quick search and you'll come across numerous articles, forum postings, and plenty of videos that put these two systems in head-to-head battles across various categories. It seems that the Jag and the 3DO are forever linked now, and hopefully this linkage helps future generations to discover them. But let's get back to the timeline. The third 32-bit competitor famously entered the market in 1995 when Sega jumped the gun and rushed the Saturn out the door to try and get ahead of the PlayStation. Desperate stuff that would come back to bite them. Again, like the other recent systems, magazines were a little cynical towards the Saturn, basically saying that, yeah, you've seen the hype from Sega, but now read the facts. The implications there are obvious. Sony and their PlayStation 1 sprang onto the scene in 1995, and look at that lifespan. Absolutely massive, well over 10 years of active life. Shortly after that, the Nintendo 64 enters the timeline, and unlike some of the other recent systems, it comes in with a little bit more optimism from Next Generation and other magazines of the time. By the way, while we're on this topic, to promote the launch of the Nintendo 64, Toys R Us set up massive store demonstrations. I remember going into the store back then and seeing 5 or 6 Nintendo 64s hooked up, all with Mario playing. I always wondered whatever happened to those Nintendo 64s. There must have been thousands of them spread out across Toys R Us collectively. Did they get sent back to Nintendo and refurbished? What happened? Does anybody know? Oh well, let's get back to the timeline. Now by late 96, the 3DO and the Jaguar were eliminated from the timeline, and the stage was set for another extended skirmish. Not something that the major magazines of the time were going to let you miss. It was Sonic vs. Mario vs. Crash, and I'm sure it sold a lot of magazines. You can see that the Saturn dropped off the timeline first, then the Nintendo 64 faded, and as we said, the PlayStation 1 continued for a long time. Heading into the new millennium, Sega introduced the Dreamcast in 1999 and hoped to correct the mistakes of the past. This time, there was initially a lot more optimism from Next Generation magazine about Sega's chances. But just a few issues later, they were already asking if Sega was done and if the PlayStation 2, which hadn't even come out yet, had already won the next war. What's truly horrifying is just how short Dreamcast's life was. Look at that, just a tiny speck on this graphic really. Even shorter than the 3DO and the Jag. Are you kidding me? Now in late 2000, the PlayStation 2 enters our timeline and stays on the timeline for nearly 15 years. Even longer than its predecessor, and rubbing shoulders with the 2600 staying power, although selling a lot more copies than the 2600 ever did. Stunning in every respect. I remember fighting and not wanting to buy a PlayStation 2, but when Grand Theft Auto 3 came out and a few other things started to roll down the hill, I knew I had to get one. The GameCube and the Xbox enter the timeline around this period also, and stick around for a respectable period of time, setting up the next big skirmish in the console war. And again, Next Generation and other magazines were right there to make sure everybody knew that there was a war going on. They must have loved it. Finally, the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 consoles enter the timeline and bring us to the end of our graphic. It was around this time that Nintendo started to be seen as somehow outside of these main console skirmishes. With the Wii, they really managed to isolate themselves on their own little Nintendo island. Actually, given the massive Wii sales, it was more of a huge landmass. And it was here that it really became a two-horse race between Microsoft and Sony, with Nintendo seemingly doing everything they could to differentiate themselves. By the way, this red line up here, from the tail end of '94 to the beginning of 2002, represents the lifetime of Next Generation magazine, meaning that it covered this whole area here, pretty much the entire 5th generation, and probably why the magazine ranks as my favorite of all time. If you come across any back issues, they're a good read. Nothing against GamePro, EGM, or anything else, but Next Gen was definitely a different animal. Before we wrap this up and come to some kind of quasi-conclusion, let's just take a quick look at what could have been. And maybe this is overly indulgent in my own personal tastes, but it's about having fun, right? So let's take a few steps back and revisit the 5th generation of video games. Now there was supposed to be a late 5th generation system that should have bridged the gap to the next generation. I'm talking about the 3DO's ill-fated successor, the M2. Starting around mid-96, the M2 was so close to reality that it was actually featured on the header of gaming magazines as if it was already out. In fact, Next Generation magazine featured it on their magazine headers from April 96 to May 97. Does that mean the M2 wins the award for longest reigning vaporware? Now by all accounts, this thing was ready to go and should have been launched in mid to late 97. A release date that could have either been a blessing or a curse. A blessing because it would have been completely overpowered relative to the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation, but a curse because it was not quite powerful enough to deal with the imminent arrival of the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2. Still, in 97, it would have had enough of a head start to at least have a chance. The question is, would it have been destroyed once the Dreamcast came out? Or would it have somehow weathered the storm and stood toe-to-toe with the PlayStation 2 for a while, until the M3 or the 4DO could have come out? Trip Hawkins, the man behind the 3DO, is actually on record as saying he lists the 3DO as one of his regrets in gaming, saying he did stuff way too fast and learned a lot of things about how to go out of business. So I guess we probably know how he feels about the M2, and I'm sure if he ever saw this video, he'd probably want it yanked off of YouTube. All jokes aside, I know that for every system on this timeline, there are a lot of people that got a lot of hours of joy. Even the consoles that were only around for a few blinks of the eye. They all contributed something in their own way. You know, the average lifespan among these 17 consoles was 7.8 years, so nearly 8 years. So imagine this. A kid that got the theoretical average console when he or she was 10 years old, in theory, that child could have been playing that same system from 5th grade all the way through to their high school graduation. And some people have it really tough, and so their game system becomes a good friend, a loyal friend that is always there when they need it. It's no wonder that there's so much passion about these systems when you have these kinds of bones. That wraps it up. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe if that's something you don't mind doing. And maybe check out some of my other videos where I dive a lot deeper into the numbers behind certain consoles and issues. Until next time, all the best.